Last July, 2018, I was staying in a very isolated region, which had very limited access, behind 3 locked gates and 20 miles south of Whitehorn, California, on a primitive 4x4 road. This place is at the end of the world, on the northern border of a vast green belt spreading from Shelter Cove on the coast, east to Highway 101, and south to Fort Bragg, and east to Piercy, as can be seen on Google Earth. At about 3 a.m., I was awake. It was a hot and dark night in these mountains. Something above my tent location, approximately 200 to 300 meters, began knocking on wood, best described as loud whacks on a tree trunk by a big club or branch. It started with one knock, which got my attention, with a brief hesitation, then several more knocks, but randomly timed, some in succession, others after hesitations. The knocking was loud, so loud that it echoed down the canyon. The event lasted only a minute or two. My first thoughts were that there was no one on the mountain. Who could be out here in the middle of a primitive and protected area? These knocks were obviously from something large, and no North American animal could have made them. I listened intently while my mind tried to wrap around how the noise was made. The woods were silent, not even a cricket. I told a few locals afterward and learned that there were other hot spots for squatch sightings between Piercy and up to Willow Creek. Flash forward 2 weeks ago, when waiting at the first lock gate to the same conservation area, I heard 2 distinct vocalizations which cannot be explained. As I waited in the dusk for about 45 minutes, waiting to meet a party at the gate who were running late, I heard a very loud wailing, screaming sound that I've never heard before in nature. The call of this thing I located at about my 2 o'clock, facing east and up the heavily wooded area above me, about 200 to 300 meters. I instantly knew where I had heard such an unfamiliar call. About 3 years ago, when watching a Bigfoot reality show, where these squatch hunters were making this strange, unique call while searching for Bigfoot. There was a few second delay from the first call, then a few more, then silence for about a minute, leaving me to wonder if this whole experience was real, pondering what I know about the wilderness. Either that was an unknown animal, or some kind of implausible prank. It was loud, echoing down the mountain, as though some huge creature could belt like that. The lungs of Pavarotti, only much louder. The chance of it being a prankster waiting in silence with me for 45 minutes in that remote location, just to hang out in these impenetrable woods and prank me, went away very quickly when another call at about 300 to 400 meters to the north of the first, approximately to my 8 o'clock. It was also just as loud, just as unique as the first, but came only 3 calls in succession, with a distinct higher pitch. This absolutely blew my mind, because the first call might be an elk on steroids, but the response from what was clearly not an owl brought chills down my spine. This was some kind of communication between 2 individuals, neither which can be explained by any rationale. I must tell you that I have trekked and lived in remote areas in Africa, Australia, Central and South America, many places of potential danger, and never had an inkling of fear. I was born and raised near Yellowstone Park, with 100 times the average distance trekked by most individuals in their lifetime, and never had bad experiences with grizzly, mountain lions, and wolves. Traveling all these years with a firm understanding of ecosystems, I never could have believed in such mysteries, that anything new would ever be discovered. I had a 4th experience, which I must say something about, but it happened just the night before the dual vocalizations. On Friday evening, November 1st, 2019, I had just moved into a cabin that my brother and I rented, located along extremely rugged canyon area of the Mattole River. It was dusk, quite dark already in the forest. I was outside looking at the stars, taking in the newness of these rugged surroundings. Up above, again about 300 meters up and to the east of the river, there was a screaming that was so loud and so foreboding that I could only listen in amazement. It was the loudest screaming I've ever heard. So loud I thought it was produced by some kind of banshee from a horror film. The screams continued, full throttle, for over 5 minutes. I know mountain lions can scream, but nothing like this. It sounded much louder, more guttural, literally as if somebody had set up a loudspeaker and played the bloodiest scream that Hollywood could produce. At the time, the night after Halloween, I wondered if somebody was up on the mountainside pranking me as a newcomer to the neighborhood. I listened for a bit, then went inside and told my brother about it because it was just so unnerving. Bigfoot did not even enter my mind. But then at dusk the next evening, I witnessed these 2 calls waiting at the gate. I have since been over and over in my mind, why have I been so lucky as to hear or experience such a mystery? Much less 3 distinct vocalizations which cannot be explained. I began poring over USGS maps and satellite imagery to ascertain with what link may be, 20 miles apart. Are there any people or neighbors or access for individuals in the areas I experienced which may explain these? Could one individual in such obvious stress on one night have triggered the coincidental travel of at least 2 or more unknown creatures the very next night? I have talked to many locals about hearing strange noises, but no one claims anything, or they don't want to be ridiculed. Look, I am a man, 60 years old with extensive wilderness experience in forests and jungles, all over the world. The closest thing to a new species discovery for me was the Costa Rican jungles, but my mind has always been a skeptic observer, dealing in evidence-based biology as a science. What has happened to me recently has completely changed me. There is a mystery in these woods, and I have a few ideas how to answer them. My friend and I were backpacking in the Redwood National Park, north of Eureka, on a particular trail in the national park. We started hiking at about 3 in the afternoon and hiked for a few hours. Then we walked off the trail up into a small canyon for about half a mile and made camp. We found bear tracks, started to get worried, so we hung our food from a tree. About this time, 7 o'clock, we heard the first scream. It was short and didn't repeat. We started to get a little freaked out, so we started a fire and heard nothing for the next 3 or 4 hours. Then, at about 10:30, maybe 11 p.m., the screaming started again, this time lasting for about 10 minutes. It sounded like it was about half a mile away, on one of the surrounding ridges, a very eerie wail. It didn't sound human. I know what elk, coyote, and wolf calls sound like, and this was nowhere near. Very similar to recordings I've heard of supposed Bigfoot calls. We went to bed at about 2 a.m. and left the next morning without incident. I have spent a lot of time in the woods. I was a climber for 10 years, and I have heard it all out there. This was different. I was with my sons. We all wanted to camp in a Bigfoot area, so we went to a campground near Bluff Creek. We were all in the tent and in our bags. The camp had settled down, and all of a sudden, there was a whoop. They were loud as if behind us in succession. Whoop, whoop. And it seemed that they were more than one. I estimate 3, one to the left of us, one behind us, and one off in the front at a distance. Also, something either took a large step or jumped off something, and it was big. The one behind us would call first, and the one off in the distance would call back. The one to the left would whoop once, but the one behind would whoop 3 times, and the others once or twice. At the start of the whoops would be almost a pucker or click sound. I figure the one behind us was the lead because he would call out and they would answer. After about 10 minutes, the lead creature started to move off with one to the left towards the other. I wanted to look out the tent, but my youngest was with me, who was 6 and was real scared because the calls were just so loud. I stayed with him and did not get to look till it was over. I found no evidence in the morning, but earlier that day, I noticed there were markings on a tree that was not made by a bear, almost as if the bark had been picked off. I have always followed this phenomenon and believed there was a possibility. This solidified everything. Well, this was just supposed to be a fishing trip to see what the area had to offer. I had been coming to this area for the past couple of months and started to learn it a little bit better. So, I decided to go exploring for some fishing holes. All I had with me at the time was a fishing rod and a GPS receiver so I wouldn't get lost. I parked the truck and started out on foot. I had talked to 2 local fishermen about what was in these rivers and what to use. I'm from the south, and this area was like a new world to me. So I made my way down to the river along the side of the bank. At times, the going got a little hard, but I managed. I tried several places, but the water was moving too fast. So I thought I would try and find a slack part of the river, where the flow was just a little slower. Now, these woods are a lot different than the ones I was used to, so I was a little excited about this new area. I had been walking for maybe 45 minutes and covered maybe 2 miles when I saw something off in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a stump, seeing that I had left my glasses in the truck. Now, my vision isn't that bad, but I still need them for driving. But I started to feel a little uneasy due to an earlier encounter. Plus, it might have been a bear. But, being the idiot that I am, I had to get closer. I got to within about 75 yards because I was using the tree line as cover. That was as close as I wanted to get. You could say that my heart was beating out of my chest. It was like I had buck fever. Well, now that I was within good sight of the creature, it was easy to see what it was. It finally stood up, and I didn't know up until that point how big it really was. Now, I had a roommate who was 6'7", and this creature would have easily stood over him. At the best guess, I would have to say that it was 7 feet and 6 inches tall, and it had to weigh well over 400 pounds. It finally turned to me and made me out in a second, but when it turned, it didn't run away instantly. It just stood there. I guess it was trying to see what I was. We must have looked at each other for 10 seconds or so, but it felt like 10 minutes. And in that time, all I could see was the creature had dark reddish-brown hair, and the arms easily hung down to the creature's knees. But within an instant, something spooked it. The creature turned and looked down the river, and it just took off. Now the ground that this thing covered was amazing. I didn't move for a good bit because I was in shock. After the creature had left, I did the same, once I could get my feet working again. Well, it has been a couple of years since it happened, but here goes. I was stationed in California, and I would always drive around looking for the next great fishing hole. I had been driving for quite some time and had decided to pull into Humboldt Redwood State Park. Being from Alabama, I figured seeing these big redwoods would be kinda cool. So I got off of Highway 101 and took the Avenue of the Giants exit. Driving down the road, I was amazed at the size of the trees, so they kind of grabbed my attention. I started seeing a lot of places where I was thinking I could fish, so I started to slow down even more to find a place to park. As I kept driving, the river kind of started getting a little farther away, and I was about to turn around, when out of nowhere, something walked across the road, and to say the least, it shocked the you-know-what out of me. The reason why it got me a little jumpy was because of the fact that I had to have come within a couple of feet of this thing. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, 6 feet and about 220 pounds, but whatever walked in front of my truck had to have been well over 7 feet tall, due to the height of my truck, which is a Chevy Z71. Now, when it comes to the poundage of this thing, I would have to say it was well over 350. As far as physical features, all I saw was the back and arm swing. The thing never turned around for me to get a better look at it. But it had a large back and rather long arms. As far as the neck goes, it didn't really have one. The animal's traps made it look like it didn't have a neck, kinda like me. But after I did find a place to turn around, I went back to look around. Dumb, I know, to say the least. I only found a couple of tracks. They had to have been 14 to 15 inches long, Plus, the stride of this thing was a lot longer than mine. Just to make the stride this thing did, I had to make one heck of an effort. Now, all I can say is whatever I saw that day was nothing like anything I'd ever seen in the woods, and I grew up in the outdoors. On July 5th, 2004, my brother and I went on a Sasquatch expedition to the Bluff Creek area of Humboldt County, California. The first night, we stayed at Onion Lake on Onion Mountain located on Forest Service Road 13, number 1. We spent all afternoon setting up camp, taking pictures and looking around Onion Lake for Sasquatch evidence. Around 9 p.m., just as it got dark, we heard a loud grunt roar down from a hilltop just above our camp. The grunt we heard can only be described as something exhaling a great amount of air all at once. The grunt was very loud, very rough, and only lasted for a second. My brother turned to me and said, "What the heck was that?" At that moment, a deer ran down the hill from the direction of the grunt and into our camp. Then, out of the darkness, another grunt roared through the forest from our right at a distance we thought was about 100 to 150 yards out from our camp. Then we heard a grunt that strayed out from our camp that was at least 500 yards out. Then we heard the grunt from up on top of the hill again. Then the grunt to our right answered the grunt on top of the hill. And then we heard the grunt that was out 400 or 500 yards answer the grunt on top of the hill and the grunt to our right. It was as if whatever it was making these sounds were communicating back and forth to one another. This grunting was very intense for the first hour or so, but then it calmed down a little throughout the rest of the night. The last grunt we heard was around 5 a.m., just before first light. At one time around 10 p.m., we heard a loud grunt come from behind us over by Onion Lake. It turned on my 3 million candle spotlight and searched the forest in the direction we heard the grunt, but of course saw nothing. That grunt could not have been no more than 100 yards away from us, and was very loud and rough. Around that same time, the other grunts seemed to be getting closer to our camp as well, and we were starting to get scared. We huddled together in the middle of our camp with our rifles and shotguns in hand, along with our 3 million candle spotlight in hand ready to take on whatever it was making these loud grunts. We were hearing something we had never heard before in the woods, and whatever it was, it sounded like it was very big. By the sound of the grunts these things were making, we were scared. If it was not for the firearms we took with us, we would have thrown all of our camping gear into our vehicle, and we would have left a dust cloud a half-mile high and 20 miles long as we were getting ready to get the heck out of there. We got up the next morning and looked around a little bit, but we didn't see or hear anything. Whatever it was making those grunts. They were nocturnal animals, and they were only active at night. We could also tell the animals were moving around in the forest from grunt to grunt. An example would be the grunts would get loud and would come from a specific location in the woods, and then the next grunt would come from the same general location, but a little to the right or left and a little closer or further away than the grunt before. We never did hear anything walking through the dry underbrush. Whatever they were making these grunts, they moved through the woods very quietly with no sound at all, except for their grunts. We packed all of our camping equipment into our vehicle, and we spent the next night down at a different camp on Bluff Creek. That night, we had no visitors, and we returned home to Eureka the next morning. About 1 month after we returned from our expedition to Onion Lake and Bluff Creek, I was watching a show on the Discovery Channel about ball pythons in India. A large 15-foot snake was crawling on the ground in the jungle as a family of monkeys were going crazy at the sight of the snake. These monkeys looked a lot like chimpanzees, but they had black faces and black fur. At one moment, a large male monkey made a loud grunt as he threw a stick at the snake. The grunt was very loud, very rough, and only lasted for a second. I came flying off the couch and said to myself, "That's what we heard at Onion Lake." The grunt the monkey made at the snake on the Discovery Channel was the same tone, roughness, length, and sounded exactly like the grunt we heard the night of July 5th, 2004 at Onion Lake. The Sasquatch is thought to be a large primate of some kind, and my brother and I heard loud grunts coming out of the forest at Onion Lake. These grunts I later heard a monkey make on TV in India. The monkey's grunts were identical to the grunts we heard at Onion Lake. I'm not a scientist or expert on grunts, but I think this is very interesting. My brother and I were raised here in Humboldt County, and have lived here in the heart of Bigfoot country all of our lives. We have been interested in the Sasquatch Bigfoot for as long as we can remember, and we plan on making other Bigfoot expeditions in the future, because the sounds we heard coming out of the woods at Onion Lake on the night of July 5th, 2004, makes us wonder even more now about what's really out there. Last Sunday, November 16th, 2003, my friend, my dog, and I traveled from Portland, Oregon to Northern California for some late-season backpacking. We stopped at the Akins Creek campground, west of Orleans, California, and just west of Bluff Creek on Highway 96, at approximately 6 p.m., as it was too late to hike in anywhere that evening, and the Six Rivers NF website listed it as one of the campgrounds open through November. As we neared the big pay station, a sign deferred us to a render payment directly to the campground host, and as we approached the host site, it became clear that the site was vacant with just a few small items left behind. So, we took the liberty to drive in and explore the portion of the campground that was open. Driving near the southern edge, nearest to the Klamath River, we smelt a pervasive, skunky odor, but thought nothing of it at the time. Eventually, we pulled into a campsite, which was the second or maybe third from the entrance at the foot of a large hill. Our intent was to get out of the pickup, leaving the dog inside, get on our rain gear, and set up the tent as quickly as possible, as it was already quite dark and raining. Just after donning my rain gear, however, I heard some distinct hoots from within the woodline, which were decidedly not owl-like nor human-like, but could be most accurately likened to those of an ape. I asked my friend if he had heard that, but he had not, as he had two hoods pulled up over his head. I quickly scanned the woodline with my headlamp, seeing nothing out of the ordinary through the dark and rain. We'd began setting up the tent when I heard it again. "There," I said. "Did you hear it that time?" "No," he responded, but he did pull his hoods down. Shortly thereafter, we both heard another set of hoots. "What do you think that is?" he asked. I have had casual interest in the Sasquatch phenomenon since childhood, and find its existence to be scientifically plausible. I am also quite comfortable in the wilderness, having spent much of my life in the outdoors from Alaska to Costa Rica professionally, academically, and recreationally. But I never honestly expected to experience anything firsthand with such a creature. So, being educated and reasonable, I declined to respond. As we continued, we began hearing other noises. First, we heard whacking sounds of wood against wood, more probably stick against tree. Perceiving this hooting and whacking as a less than friendly display, we became a little nervous and contemplated leaving. But curiosity and the dread of packing up, moving to an unplanned location, and reconstructing in the dark, while already soaked, compelled us to stay. So, we continued constructing the tent between periodic scans of the area. The whacking continued, and we noticed it would come from different locations in short sequences, too short for one individual to move from point A to point B. Again, my friend asked, "What do you think it is?" I gave the guarded response. "I'll tell you what, I've spent a lot of time in the woods and observed a lot of animals, but I've never heard anything like this." I assume he read through the evasion to the meaning of my response, given the ubiquitous usage of the word Bigfoot, and images thereof, and the surrounding communities and some casual conversation we had on the subject during our drive. Shortly before turning in for the evening, I heard a short series of what sounded like heavy footsteps on the rocky terrain of the hillside, and the rhythm of a two-legged walk. Turn in we did, however, with senses piqued and dog tucked securely within the tent. We slept intermittently and restlessly, hearing sounds throughout the night. Most frequently, we heard the whacking. Most regularly, a rather hollow-sounding report originating from a point some distance to our northeast and up a hill. We would, however, periodically hear closer and clearer whacks from varying locations to our general southeast, once hearing a disturbingly close and firm whack from our southwest. I awoke once at approximately 3 a.m. and heard a distinct single-note whistle from the general direction of the distant hollow whacking, which were again decidedly unbirdlike, yet not quite human. Soon thereafter, we were all startled upright by a crack, followed by a loud rock slide, terminating distressingly close to our location. My friend informed me he had heard 2 other smaller slides earlier that night. After all was quiet for some time, except the perpetual whacking, we eventually slumbered down again, awakening to sunlight and finally quiet surroundings. In the daylight, we observed that the hillside was quite steep, rocky, and slightly parabolic in shape, and the rock slide ended up in our south-adjacent campsite, leading us to conclude that 1. Inspection of the hillside would be dangerous and turn up little or nothing in the way of footprints. 2. Sounds could have originated from well up the hill and carried down the amphitheater sound. If it were people playing a prank, they must be extremely dedicated to risk their lives negotiating that hill in the dark and rain, and to wait in the woods any given night for the off chance campers might come by in November. Though rock slides may naturally occur there on occasion, they certainly must not occur on the order of 3 a night, or someone would implement measures to ensure no one would camp in that location. Maybe that skunky smell we had encountered just previously was not a skunk at all. At any rate, we drove on the next morning to Willow Creek Ranger's office, making no mention of the events, to inquire as to open trails. We were instructed that much of the backcountry road system and corresponding trails was closed due to the Port Orford cedar root disease, but that we could drive into the Horse Linto Creek area and hike along the closed roads. We took that advice and spent the next 5 nights uneventfully. We decided to return to Akins Creek for the final night, which was Saturday, November 22nd, to take advantage of the open, flat space to dry wet equipment and see if we could observe anything further. We picked an open site midway between the foot of the hill and the highway, laid out equipment for drying, then decided to day hike somewhere nearby. We drove up Bluff Creek Road to its closure at the road junction to Fish Lake, and then hiked 1.6 miles down that road. I paid close attention to the steep clay roadsides, and once noticed what could have been a partial footprint of a large, human-like foot from the heel, about 4 inches in width, to a point about 6 inches forward, and perceivably midway along the length of the foot. I found, however, no other footprints or enough context to draw any real conclusion about the impression. That night, back at the campground, we kept a large campfire and kept some down and dead cedar nearby to throw in for quick brightness if needed. At one point, my dog suddenly barked and charged toward the trees at the edge of the campground, just below the freeway. I halted him and went to investigate, but found nothing unusual. Though better prepared, we neither saw nor heard anything further that night. We returned home, however, with a new awareness.